Mock 18, the first passage, question number 67 to 70 belong to this passage. Now this is undoubtedly a very difficult read because the passage talks about Greek mythology and it comes from the subject philosophy. There are certain terms in this passage which will be very difficult for many students to understand. So before discussing the questions, let's get an idea about certain terms which have been mentioned here. For example, the first major term which is mentioned here will be nessus. Now, nessus here, the spelling differs too. Sometimes it's written as Nessus. Now, nessus was a centaur. A centaur is a mythical creature whose upper body is that of a human and lower body is that of a horse. Now, Heracles, who was a Greek warrior, he killed Nessus, and the Nessus's tainted blood in turn destroyed his family and Heracles himself. Now, that's one of the mythology which is mentioned here. Now, of course, here it is not mentioned in the literal, meaning, but here what it says is how the Greeks in their early intellectual development or early period of their intellectual development found out that the mythology that they had inherited from their Aryan ancestors were not sufficient, or that branch of knowledge was not enough for them to understand the workings of nature or to explain the natural phenomenon, and they found out that they need a different kind of uh, branch of knowledge which will help them or which will free them from their dependency upon the mythology or the tradition of mythology that they had inherited. One name which is very important here is Thales. Now, Thales was a Greek philosopher and mathematician. In fact, he is known to be the first human to whom a mathematical discovery has been attributed. He used deductive reasoning in trying to find out many formula for geometry. He was the first mathematician to do so, as per the information that we get on him. Thales was also a philosopher. He preceded Socrates in a timeline. So Aristotle, regarded him very highly and many times had described him as the first major Greek philosopher. Thales believed that the constituent element of all natural phenomenon or matter is water. So something that modern scientists also believe in. One important role that Thales did was he tried to explain his philosophical ideas without involving the mythology. He tried to rid his ideas from the branch of mythology, which till then was the main source of explanation for any kind of philosophical speculation in Greek. Now, apart from that, a priori is a term which means something that happened before. Apart from these terms, of course, students must know about Athena and Ares. They were brothers and sisters. Athena was the goddess of war, who was known for her intellectual ability, her strategy, and Ares was the god of war, who was Athena's brother. He was one of the 12 Olympians, and he was known for his brute power. In many of the Greek myths, he is given credit as, or he is represented as that brute masculine force in warfare. Now, apart from all these, the meaning of this passage is that it talks about that period in Greek civilization where philosophers for the first time, or common people for the first time, started thinking about the value of the mythology or the tradition that they had inherited. So they were questioning. For example, the most important paragraph here will be this paragraph where it says, now, while this tendency to look for metaphors and hidden meanings must be ranked as one of the germs of historical criticism, yet it was essentially unscientific. So what this passage talks about is how the scientific principles evolved in Greek philosophy. Its inherent weakness is clearly pointed out by Plato, who showed that while this theory will no doubt explain many of the current legends, yet if it is to be appealed to at all, it must be as a universal principle, a position he is by no means prepared to admit. So it invokes Plato, and if you look at the last paragraph, rejecting then the allegorical interpretation of the sacred writings as an essentially dangerous method, proving either too much or too little. Plato himself returns to the earlier mode of attack and rewrites history with a didactic purpose, laying down certain ethical canons of historical criticism. Plato, as you know, was the proponent of the idea of utopia. Utopia is the ideal world, and Plato, in his Republic, had written that poets and writers must be banished from the ideal republic. Reason is they talk about unscientific things, they just copy whatever already is there in the world that talks about, the imitation twice removed from reality. Then he writes these words: God is good, God is just, God is true, and that God is without the need for vindication of humans. So here is talking about, how mythology need not be explained by humans, but in describing other things, scientific principle must be applied. That is the gist of this passage. Now let's take a look at the first question. Question number 67. What could have been the author's purpose in using the line "new wine of free thought" into the old bottles? Now, this is the last line of the first paragraph. It's a contextual meaning question, or you can also call it a specific idea question, because it says what could have been the author's purpose. Looks like an inferential question, but it can be called a specific inference question too, because the answer would be clustered somewhere here. So in these kind of questions, look at two lines before the line that starts, or the line that is in question, and then you can also read two lines below it, but your answer must be clustered somewhere here. Now here it says, when the spiritual ideas of the people can no longer be satisfied by lower material conceptions of their inspired writers, and when men find it impossible to pour the new wine of free thought into the old bottles of a narrow and a trammeling creed. Now, what can it mean here? What is the author's purpose in using the line? Of course, he's talking about change. He's talking about that period in Greek philosophy or Greek civilization, where they were talking about branching out into a new field of thought. So option 1, option A, it says to convey an urgent need for drastic change. Now the word drastic here makes it incorrect. The reason is the author does talk about the need for a change, but whether the change is drastic or not, there are no words given in the paragraph which justify. And it's an extreme term, so if I look at it, I should eliminate A. Then I go to B, to imply that certain old ideas had to be discarded in order to facilitate generation of new ideas. If I compare A and B, B looks like a better option, of course. Now here it says to imply that our old ideas had to be discarded. Now here it says the old ideas were not enough to explain the new phenomenon, or it was not enough to satisfy the intellectual curiosity of the new generation. But whether these old ideas had to be discarded or modified, or they were to be updated, nothing has been mentioned here, at least in these lines. And if we read the entire paragraph, we find out that the author doesn't really support the discarding of the old ideas. He in fact advocates the branching out, or sorry, he advocates the evolution of a new idea. It can be based on the old ideas too. So the word discarded is not justified, and it also gives it an extreme tone, hence we can eliminate B. Option C says to indicate that it was time to change. Now it looks like the best option till now. D says to affirm that social changes must happen despite public resistance. Now the word public resistance is nowhere mentioned. Nowhere it is mentioned that the people were against the old ideas. They were simply not happy with the old ideas or the mythology, and they wanted some kind of a change. But resistance is an extreme term. So if I look at the four options, out of B and C, C is the best answer.